There has never been more interest. There's an appetite out there.
We have been hearing more and more stories about people coming to faith.
People are searching for a meaning and purpose.
What's happening with Gen Z? Why are they buying so many Bibles? Why are they turning to church?
Are we in the middle of a quiet revival, a missional moment?
It is the person of Jesus raised up that is going to change your life. You've already found Jesus. It's to raise him up, to point him out above all of these cultural storylines so that people can see him, look upon him, and see their lives changed and transformed. Hello and welcome. My name is Jo Frost, here with my co-host Peter Lynas. This is Being Human. This season we're looking at big cultural storylines and shifts, something that we're noticing and seeing happening in the culture around us. We take a step back, see the connection points between these cultural storylines and the God storyline, recognizing that there is nothing new under the sun, as the writers of Ecclesiastes reminds us. So we are asking ourselves, what can we learn from the God story, and how might we engage with the cultural stories around us as we seek to live truly, fully human lives with Jesus at the centre? We finish up with some practices about how we can reorientate and reform ourselves into the person and the presence of God, what it looks like to live out these human lives as daily practices. So today, Peter, what is it that we are looking at?
Well, we're looking at, are we in the middle of a quiet revival, a missional moment, a time of increased spiritual intrigue? There seems to be something going on. There is increasing interest. The stats tell us this. The stories tell us this. Is it a particular generation? Is it a particular group? Is it true that there is increased interest? Because some people feel it, some people don't. So we're looking basically at, is something happening spiritually in the water out there?
I love it. This time last year, I was chatting to a colleague of ours, and we were wondering whether or not it was possible to be in revival and not to know it. And by the end of the conversation, we said, yes, it is definitely possible to be in revival and not know it. We were wondering whether or not we might be. That sense hasn't really diminished over the last few months. In fact, as we say, we have been hearing more and more stories about people coming to faith in different places and in different spaces, but we are also hearing more and more research and evidence. So it is exciting. Where are we seeing these things? We've got three areas that we really want to focus on, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we're seeing them amongst young men, uneducated, disenfranchised, unemployed. So one of the things that the church has struggled with is men, and particularly young men. And so that has been a challenge. That's one area. The generations, we've said younger, Gen Z more generally, we've got a lot of stats coming out saying that. We're hearing from the student groups that that's really pushing. And there's a kind of public nature to some of this. So we've talked about Justin Brierley before. He's talked about some of the kind of more public intellectuals, if you like. Jordan Peterson's definitely front end. Lots of other people more publicly saying they're interested in faith. And what does that mean? And those are all interlinked, and there's lots of little connections there. But I suppose we're trying to say, look, there's at least three bigger trends that we're seeing around this.
Yeah. So if we start with the men, I've been really interested about this whole trend for a while now. When I came to faith as a student in the early noughties, one of the things that I noticed was that it was interesting how many girls were in church and in student spaces compared to guys. It felt quite female. And that trend has probably exacerbated over the last 20 years. And you're seeing more and more women in churches and less men. And this has been a conversation for a long time. We are seeing a shift in that. And I think that goes something to the cultural stories as well. I'm a bit of a geek, as people may be aware. I was listening to The Rest is History, talking about the rise of the fascist and Nazi movements in Germany in the 1930s. And they were tracking that political movement because of the undereducated, underemployed and disenfranchised male population within Germany at the time. That the life prospects of men in that space were diminishing, and therefore the rise in the political hard right and far right movement was taking root. I was mirroring that with some of the research that I was seeing coming through about undereducated, underemployed, and disenfranchised men in the UK and in the West today, and going, gosh, if we haven't learnt from history, I'm wondering where some of the alt-right, hard-right, populist right movements are coming in. What does that say about our men? I started praying. It's like, God, you really need to do something. You really need to do something with these guys because history would tell us this doesn't go well. And within about a month, I started hearing stories about more and more men coming to faith. They're starting, it seems, with some of these intellectuals, the Jordan Petersons, even the Russell Brands of this world, are influencing men in a spiritual space or in a biblical space. But the journey they go on from those voices to faith in Jesus for themselves is quite an interesting one. Peter, where are you hearing or seeing any of this?
Oh, yeah. So definitely in various spaces like you. So we were hearing stories. So we've got teams out in the road. They're out teaching, preaching. We're hearing churches saying people are coming. But then we're going, well, is this just because we're maybe in thriving larger churches that tend to invite us in? Then we're hearing from the student movements, Fusion, UCCF and others saying they're seeing more people in general wanting to engage. And again, they are seeing more young men engage, which is a different pattern than they had seen before. And then definitely around the events kind of spaces where Jordan Peterson has undoubtedly shaped a part of the conversation. And then we had, what do you call him, Joe Rogan's show where he had Wes Huff on. And like there were 5 million views or listens to this 3 hour long interview. It's very blokey. So Joe Rogan's biggest person on Spotify, biggest kind of got the biggest listenership. There's a longer story into this, but fundamentally ends up with this Canadian apologist who, in the nicest possible way, is kind of a bit of a nobody, unknown guy through a whole interesting little subset of stories. The Qumran texts, and it's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's all these lovely. He's a real into the ancient languages, and this is how he got on. Billy Carson, if you're interested, that was the side tangent in. Anyway, so he does this for 2 hours, but then at the end, he keeps kind of pressing in with Joe Rogan and does this really interesting, I think beautiful apologetic moment where they've gone down all the rabbit holes, they've jumped all over the place as Rogan tends to do, and then he starts to say, but who do you think Jesus is? Like an incredible human being, I think Rogan starts with. And he goes, yeah, but is he more than that? He says, I think he is. And they have this really interesting exchange going on.
Wow.
We just keeps leaning a little bit further. And so it's a lovely model of how to do it. It's 3 hours, we're all over the place, and then gets to the point. I think it will appeal to men. There's a lot of intellectual stuff there, but actually it comes down to who do you think Jesus is? You can go all the way around these intellectual kind of potential sideshows. And it's one they actually discuss Peterson's faith, and it's interesting. Wes Huff boldly, I think, says, look, Peterson's got part of this, but not all of it. And talks very openly about that. That, at the time I looked at it and listened to it, was watched by 5 million people on YouTube. I would guess at least another 5 million had heard it by then. You're talking in excess of 10 million people. That would make it the biggest apologetic moment, I would say, in my lifetime. I mean, this well exceeds the kind of Billy Graham moments. And so I think it is really interesting. And it's a journey, and it takes people longer. We were hearing some stats even just recently in an event we were at about how few people continue after that event around Billy Graham and the importance of discipleship. And that's one of the questions I definitely have, like we have in this moment. So where am I hearing? That is one of the most interesting little moments. And yet when I talk to church leaders, loads of them haven't heard of it. I'm going, if you want to engage young men, you need to be in this kind of space, because that's where they're getting at least intrigued about this.
I think absolutely. And I think what Peterson seems to be tapping into, and some of the others, is this question around purpose and what is my life for. But it starts there. It doesn't end there. It does end as people coming into this idea that Jesus is so much more than they had previously paid attention to, and it is the person of Jesus that is tipping people over. We are seeing similar trends, not just in young men, but in Gen Z across the board. There are more and more stories, more and more stats, more and more just confusion around people going, sorry, what's happening with Gen Z? Why are they buying so many Bibles? Why are they turning to church? Why are they professing a spirituality that their parents had dismissed? It is a really, really interesting movement that we're seeing. And so many people seem to suggest that, it's pockets and we're overinflating some of the stories, but actually what we're seeing more and more is more and more research is being done at the moment. And there is really strong empirical evidence to say that this is really happening.
It is, but the pockets point I think is important, because I think it is possible to be in a pocket and say this isn't happening in my world, and that's possible. We know from some of the church stats, if you look
Absolutely.
overall, it's almost like a flat line, but there are a significant number of churches that have seen decline or closure, and a significant number growing, and then that flattens out in the middle. And so some of the larger churches found COVID and post-COVID difficult, but are bouncing back. And some of that is to do with which generations they're attracting. So you could absolutely be in a church, in a community where you're seeing almost none of this. So it's the reason we like to go to stats sometimes to say, look, the Bible sales have increased 87% in 5 years. It's just a massive increase.
That's mad.
Yeah. And Bible Society are saying it's Good News Bible. The youth edition is the one that they're seeing the biggest change in. So we know that from some of the stats that that's where some of it is. We also know, like the Times ran the survey, like Gen Z are way less likely to be atheists. Only 13% compared with 25% of Gen Xers. That's a big shift, and they're way more likely to be spiritual. So
we just remind people, so Gen Zs are approximately 14 to 27.
It's good.
Is terms of an age bracket. And Gen Xers are, hang on, how old am I? So 44 to 60, 59, 60.
Something like that. Yes, it's about a 15-year bracket. That's correct. There were millennials in the middle. We haven't forgotten about them because they straddle a little bit.
So millennials, I'm a geriatric millennial. So we're talking about 43 down to about 28.
Yes.
So a lot of people assume that millennials are young people, but they have actually grown up, which is slightly worrying. But yes, so in terms of these generational buckets, again, there is so much noise within them, but sometimes it's just helpful to look at kind of macro trends. Yep. And the macro trend of the Gen X's, so the 44 to 59-year-olds, are very strongly atheist, quite skeptical, quite cynical, doing their own thing, getting it done, head down. Everyone else is flaky and useless, but they're going to pull the world up by their bootstraps. Whereas the Gen Zs, who are in GCSEs, A-levels, degree, and first jobs, they're the ones that are tracking much more open to spirituality, but actually even more than that, coming to faith, and specifically coming to faith into Christianity.
Definitely. So if you look at the church, boomers are still dominant, the older generation, and then Gen X, so my generation, the sort of 40s and 50s, were the group, they were in decline. And so the presumption was this was an ongoing story of decline. It was going to get worse. And millennials, it wasn't quite clear. Maybe we're continuing that. And so the sense is you've got this top-heavy church of this older generation who are providing the money and just about keeping the thing going with the 20 old ladies meeting at church. And Gen X were so stretched and couldn't be bothered and kind of checked out to some degree. And it was in decline. But the stats are now telling us it's not in decline. There is a kind of dumbbell, if you like. It's heavy at that boomer end. And Gen X and to some extent the millennials are stretched out and are struggling faith-wise and aren't as dominant. But it's not getting worse. In fact, we're actually seeing a significant growth in Gen Z. So the most recent stuff has come out from the Bible Society, and they produced some stats. They are seeing like a 3-fold increase in that. Now, it's not absolutely compensating for that, but it is so statistically significant that the people running the research had to kind of check it because they were like, this is off the charts, like kind of growth. So this is worth getting excited about.
It's really worth getting excited about. So we're seeing it in the anecdotal, we're seeing it in the stats, but we're also seeing it in the public eye. Justin Briley's, the last few years, has been talking about the surprising rebirth in belief in God. He's been tracking some of the intellectuals, that kind of new atheism movement that seems to have fizzled out and burnt itself out, and this rise in curiosity around faith and Christianity and an openness to get weird, as Tom Holland would put it. But there is a really interesting intellectual space around Christianity.
There,
increasing.
absolutely. Look, Tom Holland, you mentioned The Rest is History. He is the kind of co-host of that. Tom Holland wrote this book that really dominion around the importance of Christianity and Western civilization. Lots of people began to go, oh, and he has probably gone from atheist to agnostic, I would think, and very interested. Lots of Christians get excited about him. I don't think he has yet declared or in any way he's come to faith. Jordan Peterson then went significantly kind of further on that journey, I would say, and certainly globally raised this whole question, like how important is the Christian story to all of his views and the whole and Western civilization. And that's the frame they're tending to use, and there's limitations around that for sure. But Peterson is definitely up the ante. What's come behind them then is people like Louise Perry, a radical feminist, who then said, in short, my feminism, I could only have that with the Christian story, to such an extent that she has become a Christian and is much more public about that, having initially kind of resisted a bit, and now recommends a 321 Speak Life kind of podcast at the start of her own podcast, or a course, sorry. Ayan Hirsi Ali, who converted from being a Muslim and from Islam to being an atheist, and she was very clear about that, toured with Richard Dawkins for many years, and then began to say, intellectually I'm finding the Christian story is what frames Western civilization. And then began to say, well, actually, it's more than intellectual in my heart. I'm now going to a local church and I'm exploring what that means. And she's talked to Richard Dawkins very openly about that. They've done a kind of debate on that. And then her husband, Sir Neil Ferguson, economist, historian kind of guy, he has also come to faith. And you're getting more people. You mentioned Russell Brand earlier, Adam Peaty, the swimmer. It's not just intellectuals. You've got Giles Corran, even recently in a newspaper, saying, I'm not necessarily there, but I've gone from being an atheist to an Anglican. And I'm kind of interested in what church is doing. And so more and more people, and just to finish on that, Justin Brierley, who you mentioned, saying that this is actually happening in Finland, it's happening in Norway, it's happening in other countries. We're definitely seeing it in the UK, but we're also seeing it in other places, certainly in the Western culture, which is really interesting and exciting.
I think so. I think some of the things that I'm noticing about this exploration of the Christian faith in the public space is just how open people are being about this journey, either the one that are embarking on and they're saying that they're curious about Christianity and about who Jesus is, or they're talking about the fact that they have experienced transformation and that they have come to faith in Jesus and what that has looked like. So whether that's Adam Peaty being really open, as we've mentioned, the Olympic swimmer, who's talked about coming to faith and just what that meant when he was right at the bottom of his mental health and a real deep crash that he'd experienced, and finding faith in what that had looked like. And you've got somebody like Bobby Brazier, who is Jade Goody of Big Brother fame, and now he is EastEnders, I think, but I know him through Strictly Come Dancing because I'm that cool. That he is talking about meditation and mindfulness that his dad introduced him to help him cope with some mental health challenges. And actually he took that practice, but realized that he wasn't just meditating and being mindful, he was praying. And it was the contemplation of experiencing God. And he is less clear about who that God is that he is experiencing, but he is very open to finding out more about it. Or you've got the singer-songwriter Ray, who again was talking about some of the challenges that she was facing, whether that was through drug and alcohol abuse or her own mental health challenges. And actually, she says that if she hadn't refound her faith, she wouldn't be here today. And so you've got these younger people coming in, being really open about some of their internal struggles and why they were exploring there has to be something more to life than this. And instead of looking at Christianity as a weakness or as a crutch, they're absolutely crediting it as something that has saved them and rescued them and brought them into a fuller, more deeper human life. And I think that's amazing.
I think so too. Look, we probably, and we could talk about this all day. What we want to flip to is, okay, how do we anchor that in the God story? Because there are more complex needs coming in with people. They're less biblically literate, which is both a pro and a con in some ways, because some of what the biblical literacy that people carry in can be really troublesome. Their understanding, they're often doing this alone, and yet then they connect with community. So that's kind of really interesting, the need to be in a community. And there are definitely, as we said last week, discipleship challenges. So for me, I want to starting to go through. We mentioned Daniel last week, and I find him a really interesting character as we try and navigate some of what's happening in culture. There's still that I think, exilic frame to what we're doing. We're living in a culture that is shifting a little bit, but still not fundamentally receptive to Christianity. It's rejected that story. And Daniel finds himself as a young man. So again, resonates with some of the audience. We're not saying this is exclusively male or young, but that's definitely a trend. And so I find him an interesting character trying to wrestle with, and kind of the contrast with Jehoshaphat, the king, who had all the potential benefits of being Josiah's son and should have been the guy seeking God's word and God's plan, and didn't. He messed things up, didn't understand his identity, the king who was kind of carried off into exile, and killed ultimately in the raid. And Daniel does understand where he's anchored in this story, and he's trying to navigate what it's like to live in a different culture, where he's learning a different language and he's understanding different cultural habits. And one of my favorite verses in the Bible, in Daniel 1, where Daniel resolves not to defile himself with the king's food and wine. And we're trying to help people navigate some of this cultural moment to understand the story that shapes, and say, well, what is this story I've been invited into? And I guess, again, we talked that last episode, sometimes of that language. If I invite Jesus into my heart on my terms, and it's actually we're being invited into this larger story. And this for us is absolutely critical to the kind of being human project, the invitation in and anchoring in that story. And somebody like Daniel really helps us in that. And one other point I'll say in him is I think the power and importance of relationships. So if you went to Sunday school, and I know biblical literacy's dropping, but you might have said, make the bed, shake the bed, and into bed you go. Mishael, Shadrach, and Abednego, his three friends.
Sorry.
Nobody else.
What now?
Nobody else remembers to make the bed, shake the bed, and into bed you go. How do you remember Daniel's mates' names? Okay, well, I'm so Gen X and so old now. I'm Daniel had three really good mates, and that was really critical to supporting him. So when you're coming to faith on your own, and we're seeing increasing numbers of people doing that, one of the things we're saying is, well, how do you navigate the space? You've got to have friends and people supporting you. But also on the outside, sometimes looking outward again, I think sometimes Daniel is held up as this kind of bastion of Daniel says no, and he rejects the king's food and wine, and he's kind of the protest. This is the way we do life as Christians. We're kind of, I refuse it. I get behind me. You're. But actually, you read it, and he says no. He went to the palace official, Aspenaz, I think his name is, and he's not sure. So he goes to the local guard, and he has good relationships there, and he negotiates and says, let's do a 10-day trial. If this works out, can we go a bit further? And actually, when you read about Daniel, it's a very interesting relational way of engaging. I think sometimes Christians are a bit like, culture's bad, put up the stop sign. And actually, Daniel has a much more nuanced way of engaging in cultures. He's got the support of his mates. You've got to have people around you to navigate this space. But you've also got to do it in a really relational way as we look out to others around us.
So good. So good. So for me, this conversation around what's stirring in the culture and in personal individual lives that is causing people to go, this isn't working, and I can't fix it. Something has to change, and I don't know what to do. And I think we can track that through in so many different spaces. I mean, arguably, that's what you and I are always talking about the cultural stories that are broken and breaking us in our world at the moment. And so there is that move. And I'm just reminded, it just keeps coming up. There's a conversation between Jesus and a religious leader called Nicodemus in the Gospel of John, which is one of the stories of Jesus' life in the New Testament in the second half. And in John 3, this religious leader, this guy called Nicodemus, sneaks out to Jesus and has a chat with him and goes, what is going on? And it is the ultimate conversation of cross purposes and miscommunication. Nicodemus does not understand anything that Jesus is saying and is very confused, which I also think is quite interesting. You're talking about biblical literacy. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand what Jesus is trying to say. And there is a lot of confusion. And so Jesus reminds Nicodemus of a story from the Old Testament around the Israelites in the desert, where God had raised them out of Egypt and was guiding them to the promised land. There's this story in Exodus where a plague of snakes comes into the camp, and people are bitten, and people are poisoned, and people are dying. They are sick, they are desperate, they are dying. And Moses cries out to God to come and rescue them and save them. And God says that he needs to make a bronze snake and raise it up above the camp so that everybody in the camp can see it. And if they gaze upon this raised up snake, then they will be healed. They will no longer be sick. They will no longer be scared, and they will no longer be dying. And Jesus says, I am going to be that bronze snake. I am going to be lifted up so that anyone desperate, anyone sick, anyone dying can look at me and find eternal life. And that's the story with Nicodemus. And that's the story of Jesus. It's not going to be Jordan Peterson's 12 rules. It's not going to be some intellectual argument about cultural Christianity. It's not a movement of feminism or populism or any of the other political spaces that is going to help you if you are feeling sick or desperate, or just if you're asking, is this the life that I have got ahead of me? It is the person of Jesus raised up that is going to change your life. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people asking deep, fundamental questions, but in that exploration of finding the person of Jesus. And so our responsibility, if we've already found Jesus, is to raise him up, to point him out above all of these cultural storylines so that people can see him, look upon him, and see their lives changed and transformed.
I think it's great. I think the challenge of Nicodemus is so helpful there. One, the deeper, richer element of the story that Nicodemus, even as somebody who did think he understood it, didn't quite get. And the call that is going to be Jesus, not going to be the religious rules. It reminded me of the rich young ruler. It wasn't necessarily that selling all you have is the key to everybody, but there's something beyond. There was a push. Jesus is going to ask that question. And Peterson is kind of like, I'm interested in Jesus, but here's the 12 rules. And some of the other characters around us are like, I like Jesus, but I'm going to use him. Kind of almost feel like we're co-opting Jesus into our agenda. And the reality is that that's not possible. That's not what Jesus is offering. There is a fall at your feet moment. Look, we sacrifice and submit everything to him. And that's going to be money. That's going to be pride, power, sexuality, like just across the spectrum. There's that call. And I think that's going to be the bit, I suspect in this moment, there's going to be real interest and intrigue. And then there's going to be the awkward moment. A few times we're going to say, actually, what he's calling is not a pick and mix religion. It's not my version of, or you don't get to co-opt it in, is laying down. And we've all done it. Listen, many of us, 20, 30 years Christian experience, we're still doing a bit co-opting without, and we're constantly being called back to say, actually, this Jesus is lifted up in the desert and we lay down, and that is the only pathway. There's nothing we can bring. I'm not trying to go into worm theology, but there is something about the submission and the laying down that is absolutely necessary in this moment, and a challenge in this cultural moment that we're in.
Yeah, so good. I think for me, that laying down, that falling at the feet, is also a challenge to us, which is in all of these moments, do we know nothing save Christ and him crucified? That actually, when he was lifted up, it was for the sake of the whole world, because God loved the whole world, that he gave his only son, that all may look on him and believe and be saved. So when it comes to practices in that moment, when it comes to our response to the cultural stories that we're seeing and this missional moment that we're tracking, what are the practices that help us reorientate ourselves to the person of Jesus and reform ourselves into his likeness? Because it is all Jesus. So how are we going to help live our lives as if God is in charge of it and not us? What are the practices that reorientate you, Peter? Where does your mind go?
Well, I think, the most obvious one is witness. It kind of has to be, and it's part of our everyday lives, is what we should be doing. But there's a kind of practice element to it. Sometimes we have to push ourselves out of our comfort zones because there has never been more interest. There's an appetite out there. It's an appetite for spirituality. We know there's an appetite for the Bible. There's an appetite to hear more about Jesus. And when people get excited about it, one of the great things is that the stats amongst Gen Zs tell us they are passionate and they want to share. So we're seeing an increasing aspect of that. But we know that witness is around friendship is the primary point. So people are searching for a meaning and purpose. They're often doing it alone, but where they will track a little bit is either a friend has signposted them in that direction, maybe unwittingly, like without realizing, or they'll start to turn into a friend because, the step to doing that on your own, reading the Bible and then just walking into church, is a big one. That's one of the hardest ones for people, I think, right now. So friendship is ever more critical. We know that. Our good friend Phil Knox has written a book around this because Phil saw the stats and says people come to faith through friends, outside of family, friends are critically important. We have less and less friends, and so most Christians don't have somebody to witness to. So I find that personally challenging as somebody who's a kind of professional Christian. I don't like the phrase, but we know what I mean. I spend a significant amount of my life, like you do, in circles with other Christians. And so one of the challenges is to get out there. In fact, you told me a story recently about an encounter you had.
Yeah, I finally got the taxi driver story. I feel like an actual proper Christian now. So I've had a conversation about Jesus with my taxi driver. This has never happened before. But it was amazing. We were genuinely having, it felt like a Being Human podcast conversation, to be honest. We were talking about structural corruption. We were talking about all the political and cultural trends. And his argument was that he thinks that people are by and large good, but the system corrupts you. And that basically you get plugged into a system. The system is bad and people that get corrupted because of it. And I say I would look at it slightly differently. The word I would use is sinfulness. And I said, I think that systems and structures can be sinful, but also individuals can be, which means that when you change the system, people can still corrupt it, but also people can be corrupted by systems. And if you only have one or the other, then you're always finding some excuse as to why you don't have to change the system or change yourself. And he said, that's really interesting. Do you think that there is a religion or a person that has ever managed to get on top of both the structure and the system and the individual sinfulness and corruption? Is there anyone who's ever showed us what that could look like? And I was like, that's the question. You never get asked the question. And I was like, yeah, I think that's the person of Jesus. And we'd been talking, and I'd mentioned our book Being Human, and that's all about pointing to Jesus in terms of cultural stories. And he knew my name, so he's like, "This is the best chat I've ever had in my cab. I'm going to buy you a book. I'm going to find out more about Jesus." And he was buzzing, and it was 6:30 in the morning on the way to the airport. But he was really open, and that conversation entirely was led by him. It was his curiosity. It was his exploration of the world, but it was my witness. It was my opportunity to say, I see what you're saying, but actually I view the world in a slightly different way. And because of Jesus, I can point to something better. And it's amazing the openness that's out there. The one place I would go for the practices is to the place of intercession. I mentioned it at the beginning when I heard all the stats about the men, and I'm like, God, the only place we can go is you on this. There's a sickness, there's a desperation, there is a dying in our culture. And if we don't get on our knees and ask for God to come and move and help, then nothing that we can do is going to be sufficient. And I was so encouraged. I was in church this week and we were asking about answered prayer. One woman stood up and she said, I've been married for 40 years. I've been praying for my husband for 40 years. And this week he gave his life to Jesus.
Wow.
And she was like, I had so little faith. I had almost no faith. But I went with the tiniest whisper of a prayer, all things are possible to you, God. And that was the day he gave his life to Jesus.
Brilliant.
And it's just really struck that intercession, reminding that it's all on him and not on us. That when we get on our knees and ask God to move, he is faithful and he is good.
Yeah, because even if you're in those pockets or places where maybe you're not seeing those stories, one of my encouragements is absolutely to pray. It is happening in lots of places, so pray for those who are and pray that it does become your reality. And it isn't just any particular group. So we've talked about young men, but it is a husband of 40 years there coming to faith. It is right across the board. There is openness. And one of the things that excites, we were just chatting before we hit the record button about what way does this flow up and down through the generations and what impact might more Gen Zs coming to faith have on their parents, on grandparents, on friends, on all those around. We're hearing stories in schools, and that's teachers impacting those young people, so that has an impact both ways. This isn't limited. Please don't hear us say that. I mean, we're talking about it because it's really exciting, because young men have been in a constituency that have been incredibly hard to reach, so that is fantastic. But it will just ripple and spread well beyond that. So intercede for anybody who might be on the front line, intercede for the people who are in those groups. That's where the power of prayer brings us relationally into something that's much more significant and wider that is happening. So that excites me. I think it's great to have. And on the witness one, I think, we've got partners the way who we've been chatting to in a few things. The way Insta kind of feed, if you're interested in that, I hadn't heard anything about it 6 months ago. Now I'm like, how did I know? This is phenomenal. But they're just, again, engaging young people on the street with sort of questions that we're talking about.
You're just a bit old. It just takes a
Yeah,
while for
exactly.
it to
filters
That's
up.
all we're hearing.
If nothing else, it's encouraging to watch and to see. But it's also like, oh, this is phenomenal. What is working out there? And the kind of questions that you might have thought, oh, they're doing like an identity reading, and people sitting down at a table, and just young people are coming up and asking for this stuff because they're desperate. So really encouraging to see different ways that people are engaging in this space.
So we love hearing stories. We would love to hear your stories of where you're seeing people come to faith, where you're being encouraged to both witness and intercede on behalf of your friends, your family, and complete strangers to come and find faith in Jesus. We'd also love to hear your stories about how you're encountering being human more generally. Please do keep in touch. We love hearing what God is up to in your world and how you're being impacted. So you can email us at beinghuman@eauk.org. You can find us on beinghumanlens.com. You can stalk us on all forms of social media. If you like our content, do remember to sign up to our regular news updates. If you haven't checked out this podcast on YouTube, please do pop over to the Evangelical Alliance account. You will find us there. Like and subscribe, or you can subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. We will be back again soon. Until then, take care and God bless.